So doing something special for today?
We're just having a nice dinner at home. We got some nice tuna to make sushi.
Nice, very nice.
Oh, that is up.
No sake?
No what?
Sake?
I can't quite hear with over the washing. Sorry.
Sake. No sake?
No, I never really got into sake.
No?
No, it was never a drink that I really liked. I'm pretty much a beer and wine kind of guy. I like tequila if it's good tequila, but that's about it.
Okay. Let me mute myself. So
we'll give it just one more minute while I also drink a little tea. And then we'll start in just a second. A reminder for those of you that can't quite see the screen. I don't know why it seems so narrow today. Let me see if I can't increase that. But we are on chapter 7, Mishnah number 3. Seems like the column in Sefaria is not as wide as usual, but it has been a couple weeks since we've sat to do Mishnah, so maybe it's just my memory playing tricks on me. After all, I am an old man. Okay, well, old or not, I think we have our start time. So let's go ahead and jump in. Now, I know it's been a little while, so just a little refresher from the beginning of chapter 7. We were talking about different liquid-like substances, such as wine, that might have an impact on the status of a mikvah. And that, if you go back to the last class, you'll see the first 2 Mishnayot in our discussion of that. Here in chapter 3, we're going to deal with that topic in a different way. We're going to really refine what we mean by the liquid itself being an issue. So let's go ahead and jump in and pick it up from Mishnah 3 from chapter 7. If he rinsed in the mikvah baskets of olives or baskets of grapes, and they change its color, it remains valid. Okay, so the issue here is not that the baskets are full of olives or full of grapes. These are baskets that once had olives or grapes in them. So this is not him getting ready for dinner. This is him rinsing off baskets that have already been emptied of their actual material. But as you can imagine, these baskets would have piles of grapes or olives in them, and they would leak, and that would soak into the basket. So you are dealing here with the woven, style of a basket that has absorbed some of the liquidish content. Again, this isn't water, so we're not dealing here with drawn water, so we don't have that issue. But we definitely have some liquid that has become embedded in this basket that now I am trying to rinse out inside the mikvah. And when I do, if it changes the color of the mikvah is still valid. So this is going to be contrasted in the next section. But here, the rinsing of the basket, even though it leads to a change of color in the water of the mikvah, that mikvah is still a kosher mikvah, provided it was kosher at the beginning, of course. So the mikvah color change is not a problem if the color change is coming from this secondary contaminant. It's not the right word. The secondary ingredient, because this secondary ingredient is not considered a primary substance. This is not actually putting grape juice into the mikvah. This is putting the residual stains of the basket into the mikvah. And even though it will have the same effect, a color change, it nonetheless does not invalidate the mikvah. Yes, Aaron.
Rabbi, this only applies if it's less than 40 seahs, right?
No, this applies to any mikvah. If the mikvah is less than 40 seahs, then the mikvah is not valid in the first place. But the color change does matter, even if you have a full 40 seah or more mikvah, as we're going to see.
All right, I thought they were talking about invalidating the water for some reason.
Well, I mean, that's okay. So that's the next little section. So Rabbi Yosei says dye water renders it invalid by a quantity of 3 logs, but not merely by changing its color. So Rabbi Yossi says, okay, but yeah, if you actually have the water from dyeing, meaning the vat that you dyed something in, which remember ancient world, well, actually still today, but dyeing is a very noxious process. The dye is very, very potent. It's very strong. And if you have that dye water, that's still considered water enough to count as water. So if you have 3 logs, then yes, of course, it's going to invalidate a smaller mikvah, one that hasn't reached its proper level. But as he points out, that's happening because it's water, not because it changed the color of the mikvah. However, if wine or the sap of olives fell into it and changed its color, it becomes invalid. If the actual substance, the actual wine, the actual olive, the olive oil, the juice of the olive goes into the mikvah, then yes, that if it changes the color is invalid, it invalidates the mikvah. That is not considered an okay contaminant or ingredient into the mikvah. However, what should one do to make it valid again? How do you recover your mikvah that has now been discolored? One should wait until the rain falls and the color reverts to the color of water. So it's a very simple tikkun, very simple repair for your mikvah. Let it wash out. Eventually, enough water will come from the rain that will dilute whatever was added from the wine or the olive oil to the point that the mikvah will no longer look like its color has been changed by the liquid that was added. If it contained 40 seahs, then water may be drawn and carried on the shoulder and put into it until the color reverts to that of water. If your mikvah is already 40 seahs, then you don't even have to wait for the rain. You can go ahead and dump water into it. But notice that even in this case, a larger mikvah, if it has been discolored by one of these substances, is not invalid until we have reclaimed the proper coloration of the mikvah itself. Does that help clarify? Okay. So, Natan, yes?
Yes, sorry, 1 second. But I remember that we spoke that it could be very dirty and the color was disgusting and still is kosher.
So it depends here, as we can see, from what caused the discoloration. If the discoloration was caused by the basket, then even though it's not pretty, it's not an issue. If the discoloration was caused by mud at the bottom, then it doesn't matter, it's not an issue, within certain parameters. So there are different causes of discoloration, and that's what the Mishnah is concerned with. So if you pour wine into it, that can be a problem for discoloration, even though you could end up with that same color by rinsing a basket in it. So it's not just what color is it, it's what caused that color to be like it is.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Got it. You're welcome. All right, 7.4. Oh, let's try and get it balanced. If wine or the sap of olives fell into the mikvah and changed the color of a portion of the water, let's make sure we got the visual here. So we've got our mikvah and somebody pours wine into it, let's just say by accident, and that wine falls into one side of the mikvah, but the mikvah is not being churned around and the wine did not cause much mixing when it went in. So now you have one portion of the mikvah that is discolored and one portion that is not discolored. So what is the ruling? If there is not a portion of the mikvah that has 40 seahs with the color of water, meaning clear or not contaminated by the wine, one may not immerse in there. So if you've got a big mikvah and it's 80 seahs and half of it now looks like wine, but half of it doesn't, at least for this first immersion, then you can immerse in that 40 that still looks like water, and that is considered to be a valid immersion. On the other hand, you have a 60 seah and 40 of it looks like wine and 20 looks like regular water. That 20 is not sufficient, and therefore the mikvah needs to be processed to restore it into its proper condition. So the idea here is that it really is about what fell into it and what discoloration occurred because of that. You'll notice that's why they're not giving a measure for wine or olive oil or juice, because it's not about how much went in, like it is with drawn water. It's about what impact it had on the color. Okay, now that we've got the basics, let's go to the advanced version. If a quartav of wine, a quartav, remember, is a tiny amount. The quartav of wine fell into 3 loaves of water, and its color became like that of wine, and the water then fell into a mikvah, it does not render it invalid. Okay, so let's follow the logic here. Normally, and here we are talking about a under 40 seah mikvah. Normally, if I have 3 loaves of water and they are drawn water and they fall into the mikvah, then under normal circumstances, that mikvah becomes invalid. However, if there is a little wine that is in the 3 loaves, and those 3 loaves now look like wine, then they no longer count as water, meaning they no longer count as drawn water, which means them being poured into the mikvah does not render the mikvah invalid. Now, it doesn't finish the mikvah, like that's what we learned in Mishnahs 1 and 2 of chapter 7 last time we met, but it also doesn't invalidate the mikvah. So what counts as wine? Water that has wine in it that looks like wine. Now, we just had a holiday where this was a very important topic. If you are somebody that has trouble with your 4 cups of wine, the arba kosot, take heart. In the ancient world, the rabbis would pour the wine concentrate into their cup, and then they would pour water, and then they would mix it. In fact, in the Mishnah, it describes each of the cups of wine as being mixed, not as being poured. That's just the verbiage in the Mishnah. So it is absolutely possible, permissible, and recommended, if you know your tolerance to wine, to add a little wine, add a little water, mix it on Pesach, and have that as your 4 cups, so that you do not pass out from over alcohol consumption. So very important to remember that you do still need to be conscious by the end of the Seder. Yes, Aaron, I thought I saw you flicker. There you go.
Yes. So they're basically saying the wine does not invalidate, but it also does not raise. Is that basically the ruling?
Correct. That goes, if you want to review that, go back to Mishnahs 1 and 2 from chapter 7. But here the Chiddush is that even water that has had a tiny amount of wine put into it, if it looks like wine after that, then the water does not count as drawn water.
Wait, Rabbi.
Yes?
So you mean if it looks like it's not just the wine part that doesn't invalidate or raise it, the whole thing doesn't invalidate or raise it, no matter how much?
Exactly. So you've got a big pitcher of drawn water that you got from the well. If you pour that into this small mikvah, less than 40 seahs, that mikvah will be invalidated. But if I take my pitcher of water and I pour a little bit of wine, that's what the Kortav is trying to tell us. It's like, just an ounce or something. Then if the now pitcher looks like wine, which it depends on the wines, that's, again, they're not talking about a real measurement here. They're talking about the appearance. But if it looks like wine now, then it doesn't count as water, which means if it pours into the mikvah, it does not count as drawn water. It counts as wine because wine, like I said, was always mixed as a proportion. And they're not going by what percentage of wine is in the water. They're going by how does it look. If it looks like wine, it's wine. It follows the rule of wine, and wine does not invalidate a mikvah.
Rabbi, something happened to the sound. I don't know if it's my cell phone, but suddenly now it's terrible.
Testing. Aaron, can I get a sound check from you?
Yeah, I can hear fine.
Huh. Can you hear Aaron okay, Natan?
Really? Huh.
Aaron, can you say a few things for Natan,
Yeah.
see if it works for you?
Natan, can you hear me?
Yes, but it's very, very, very bad. Very suddenly, that was perfect at the beginning, but like 30 seconds before you ask the last question, the sound dropped, and now it's very, very bad.
All I can suggest is try logging out and back in again and see if you can clear the connection.
That's what I will do.
Okay. I promise not to say anything amazing.
Every word from you is amazing, especially for today.
All right. Well, while Natan is doing that, let's go ahead and get the beginning of the next section of Mishnah 5, which is a very similar kind of topic. If there were 3 loaves of water less a kortov, into which a kortov of milk fell, and the color remained like the color of water, and then they fell into a mikvah, they do not render it invalid. Now, Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri says everything goes by the color. He disagrees. So what's going on here? So in part 1 of this Mishnah, we saw that if you have 3 full logim and you add in a little wine and it recolors everything, that it's now classified as wine. And therefore the full 3 logim do not invalidate the mikvah. Here we have just under 3 loaves of water with a kortov missing, and we add that in of milk. Now, in this case, the milk does not change the color, meaning the pitcher still looks like it's just water because there was just this tiny bit of milk going into it. So what does it look like we have? It looks like we have an entire pitcher of water, meaning that that's drawn water, and drawn water would render it invalid. But not so fast, say the rabbis, the hachamim, because we know that it is not 3 full logim of water. We know that it is just a little less, and that the extra bit is milk. Therefore, it does not disqualify the mikvah. Now, Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri says, no, I want to be consistent. If it looks like water, it should act like water. If it looks like wine, it should act like wine. So he would say, of course, this will invalidate the mikvah because it looks like 3 loaves of water, even though we know in our heart of hearts that there are 3 minus the kortov worth of milk. The rabbis disagree, and they say, no, if we know that it wasn't actually 3 loaves, then we know it wasn't 3 loaves, and therefore the mikvah does not become invalidated because of this addition. So they are being consistent along a different axis, and Rabbi Yochanan is being consistent on a different axis. And that's very normal and typical, as I'm sure that you're aware of from all of our study together, is that sometimes the argument is just about which logical principle best fits this situation. And here we see that we are following, if it was less than 3 loaves at the beginning, and we know we added milk, then it definitely is still 3 loaves when it falls into the mikvah. All right, Mishnah number 6. Now we are going to question the validity of our perfect mikvah, meaning 40 seyas exactly, based upon its usage. Now, yes, we've talked before that a 40 seya or larger mikvah cannot be invalidated, but it can be drained. And if it falls below 40 seyas, then there's a problem. Okay, so with that in mind, let's take a look at Mishnah number 6. If a mikvah contained 40 seyas exactly, and 2 persons went down and immersed themselves one after the other, right? So you have Reuben and you have Samuel, and Reuben goes down, he goes into the mikvah, and he comes up out of the mikvah. And then Samuel comes after him. Well, what does Samuel find? Well, Samuel finds what we've all found when we've seen someone else use water before us, which is when they leave, Reuben is going to be dripping water. And that means that if the mikvah was 40 seyas exactly before he went in, that when he leaves, he will take some of that water with him. It will be in his hair, it will be on the surface of his skin, some of that water, even if it's just a tiny amount, is going to leave the mikveh with Reuben, which means the first becomes clean, but the second remains unclean. Reuben gets the use of the mikveh as a purification act, but Samuel does not, because there wasn't 40 seahs by the time Reuben left. Rabbi Yehuda says, but wait, there is a loophole, if you will. If the feet of the first were still touching the water, the second also becomes clean. So Rabbi Yehuda has a principle that water flows down. We would call that gravity, but that because it flows down, water that is above will join with water that is below. Therefore, because Reuben is standing, let's say, on the top step, and so he is connected, he is contiguous to the water in the mikveh, then the additional water that's on his body counts as part of the measure of the mikveh. And therefore, the mikveh is still 40 seahs because Reuben has not technically drained that water out of the mikveh itself. He may be standing out of it, but really he's like an extension of the mikveh. He is an annex to the mikveh, and as long as the total amount of water is fine, then the water is fine for Samuel, who went in number 2. Is that clear? Questions? Okay.
Rabbi, he has
Yes.
to be standing in the mikveh, though. Once he steps out of the mikveh, it's no longer valid, right?
Exactly. Once Reuben steps out and begins drying himself off, then sorry, he took some of that water with him, and now the mikveh is below 40 seahs, and it is not valid. If he is still standing in the mikveh, then he is part of the mikveh, and the water on him is contiguous with the mikveh, and therefore the mikveh is still valid. But let's make...
I have
Go ahead.
What happened if the mikveh was already over 4, but suddenly something happened and dropped under the 4? So stopping a kosher if you drop up under 4 when already was a regular kosher mikveh?
Yes. So let's imagine you have a nice big 100 seah mikveh, but there is a drought or there is a crack that develops, and half of the mikveh drains away. So now it's only 50 seahs. The mikveh is still kosher. You can fill it up again with drawn water, and that's fine. But let's imagine that 80% of the mikveh drains away. So now you only have 20 seahs at the bottom of this big mikveh. Well, that 20 seahs goes back to being a starter mikveh. It's not kosher yet. And if you put drawn water in it, it will never be kosher until you drain it and start all over again.
Okay.
So the mikveh does need to maintain 40 seahs. Now, that shouldn't be a problem usually, because you can always add drawn water to a 40 seah mikveh and top it up whenever you need to. That's the great thing. Just turn on the hose and put a little extra water in. But as usual, the Mishnah wants to give us the difficult scenario. So here we have Reuben and then Samuel, 1, 2. And what happens in between them? Well, Reuben takes part of the mikveh water with him, so now it's less than 40, and Samuel is out of luck. Obviously, the solution would have been, before Reuben went in, to pour in enough water so that when he left, it wouldn't cause a problem for anyone else. But we're here to learn what if. We're not here to learn best practices. If you want to learn best practices, then you should talk to people who build and maintain mikvahs. If you want to learn what if, then you study halakha. All right, so here is the next wrinkle of our what if. If one immersed a thick cloak, and when he drew it out, part of it was still in contact with the water, then another person immersed himself in the mikveh, he becomes clean. All right, so what is this additional wrinkle? Because it sounds very similar to part 1. Well, on the one hand, we saw with Reuben in part 1 that the water was still attached to him, and he was still attached to the mikveh, and therefore the mikveh was still valid. Here, however, the water is not just on the surface of the cloak, it is absorbed, it's soaked in. He is immersing this giant cloak, and the water goes into it like a towel, and that means when he pulls it up, Some of the water is on the surface, but some of it is inside. Nevertheless, in keeping with Rabbi Yehuda's opinion from the first part, the cloak, if the cloak is still touching the mikvah, meaning you're holding it up, but the bottom is still in contact with the mikvah, then even though the general mikvah level has dropped because of the water that's now suspended in the cloak, if it's touching, then it still counts as part of the mikvah, and that means that Samuel is able to immerse, and it is perfectly valid. Make sense? Now, again, if you take the cloak all the way out of the mikvah, then you've got a number of problems. Once it comes out, obviously you drop the level of the mikvah, but secondarily, if it has dropped below 40 seah and the cloak is now dripping water back in from having been detached, well, that dripping is going to be considered drawn water, and that can be a problem, which is why we're going to see in our third part of this Mishnah another issue. A pillowcase or a cushion of leather, as soon as it is taken out of the water by its open ends, the water which still remains in it is drawn water. So you want to immerse your pillowcase or your cushion, and they're made of leather. Well, they're empty, and that means when you put them into the mikvah, they're like a soft bucket, which was a very common item in the ancient world. This is a vessel. So you put it in the water and then you lift it up. Well, if you lift it up with the top facing upwards, then you've just drawn water out of the mikvah itself. And once it's no longer attached to the mikvah, you've got a bucket of water. And if it drips back in, you're adding drawn water into the mikvah. And if it's less than 40 seahs by the time you do that, then you've invalidated the mikvah. Start all over again. Solution: how should one do it? Because, I mean, sometimes I will have this 40 seah mikvah and I need to do it. I need to immerse something like this. What should I do? One should immerse them and then draw them up by their lower edges. Put the bucket upside down. Put it in with the top facing downwards, and the water will still come up and be inside all of the container, just like it needs to be. But when you remove it, you will not be taking the water with it. The water will sluice off of it, just like any other item, but it will not be inside the container. It will not be a drawn container of water. So just turn it upside down is the solution. All right, and we were talking about mud before, just tangentially about dirty mikvahs, and here we're going to go down into the mud. So we are on Mishnah number 7 from chapter 7. If he immersed a bed in it, meaning he wants to immerse the entire bed in the mikvah, even though its legs sink into the thick mud, it still becomes clean because the water touched them before the mud. So you've got the bed frame, right? So no mattress, just the frame. And you want to put this into the mikvah. Well, the bed frame won't fit into the mikvah unless it goes down into the mud at the bottom of the mikvah. And then it will be submerged under all of the water. So the question is it now immersed or not? Because that thick mud, remember we talked about many chapters ago, is not part of the mikvah. If it is super thin mud that can pass through the mouth of the bottle, then yes, that's perfectly fine. That's just like water and with mud suspension. But here we're talking about actually thick mud. So anything that goes down into that mud technically doesn't seem like it's touching the mikvah. However, say the rabbis, it's still fine because as the leg goes down into the mud, it is pushing the water with it. It is still making a cavity for the water as the leg goes down. And thus, the water is still surrounding all of the parts of the bed frame, and thus the bed can become ritually pure, even though the legs are going down into the mud. And another tricky situation, the water of a mikveh, which is shallow. Now, we still have a 40 seahs mikveh here, but the shape of the mikveh is inconvenient. Think of this as being like it's only 1 foot deep all the way around. It's not quite right, but maybe a better example. Imagine a very, very large mikveh. So it's very wide and very, very long, but it is not very full. Now at the bottom, like I said, 1 foot deep, there's plenty of water. It's definitely more than 40 seahs, but it's not really deep enough for a person to immerse yourself. Remember, it has to be not only 40 seahs, but it also has to be a shape that will cover your whole body. And trying to lie down in 1 foot of water, you're not going to get the full coverage that the mikveh has to give. What is the solution? One may press down even bundles of sticks, even bundles of reeds, so that the level of the water may rise, and then go down and immerse oneself. Okay, so what are we doing here? We are reshaping temporarily the shape of the mikveh. By putting stacks of sticks or reeds in one corner, it is causing the water to be displaced from that area. And as the water is displaced from one side of the mikveh, it will fill the other side more deeply. And that means there is then eventually room for a person to actually immerse themselves in the mikveh. Now, even though we're changing the shape of the mikveh, even though we're introducing these additional elements to try and nudge the water to where we need it, the mikveh itself is still kosher and the immersion is still valid. So you could change the shape of the mikveh, if you will, in order to make sure it would be deep enough for you to immerse yourself. Now, obviously, ideally, you have a mikveh that's 40 seahs or more. The easy answer is go to the well and just put more water in the mikveh until it's deep enough to easily immerse yourself and not cause yourself this trouble. But the rabbis are trying to make a point about what can be done in order to manipulate the water to our advantage. Yes, Natan?
Yeah, because the shape is not important. The critical part is the volume.
Well, the critical part is the volume, but the shape is important for what I can use it for. So if I have a mikveh that's only 1 foot deep, I can use it to immerse my plates, but I can't use it to immerse my body because it's not big enough to cover me. So the shape
what happens
can
if
be
you are
important.
lying?
Well, like I said, we could have a very big mikveh that has 40 seahs, but it's very shallow because it's so wide and so long, but
Right.
it doesn't have enough depth for a human body. So that's the issue. Now, again, the easy solution, if it's 40 seahs or more, just turn on the hose, fill it up, and make it deeper. But that was not the point the rabbis were making with this halakha. They want us to know that even putting these sticks in, which will disturb the water and cause it to be displaced, that is still a kosher mikveh. And then finally, one more unique way to handle the shape here in our mikveh waters. If an unclean needle is placed on the step leading down to a mikveh, meaning at the dry level of a step, the upper step, in a cavern, meaning in the proper mikveh shape, and the water is put in motion, meaning you make waves. Once a wave has passed over it, the needle becomes clean. So yes, even if we have to reshape the water by just, causing the waves to come up higher than usual, that's perfectly fine. Now, why would you do this with a needle? Well, probably because you don't want the needle to disappear in the mud at the bottom. So you put the needle up on the dry step, and then you rock back and forth, and eventually the mikveh is going to slosh up onto that step, back down, and now your mikveh, now your needle has been made clean. Very clever solution. Okay. Mishnah number 8 is going to begin introducing some interesting topics regarding the assumptions of mikvahs. Now, we've talked about this before, but I never know who's watching for the first time. There is a tendency in the modern world among people who are interested in halakha to not want to assume anything but the worst, that they are worst case scenario. What if this? What if that? How do I know? How can I be sure? And if I can't be sure, then I shouldn't use it. I shouldn't trust it. I should just assume that it's wrong and do something different. Hopefully, if you've studied with me long enough, you will have learned that's not the Mishnah and it's not the Talmud's solution. The Mishnah wants to get things right. The Talmud wants to get things right. It doesn't want to just say, I can't trust it, so let me do something else. Sometimes we can trust it, sometimes we can't. And making an assumption is not always a bad thing. It's okay to rely upon certain assumptions of what would be logical. So here we are going to deal with some assumptions that may startle you. The land of Israel is clean, and its mikvaot are clean. All right, so this is assumption number one, that the land itself, meaning wherever you happen to be standing in Israel, is assumed, unless you have evidence to the otherwise, like you're in a cemetery, it's assumed that wherever you happen to be standing is clean, that there aren't any bodies right under your feet. Likewise, if there is a mikvah that is built in the land of Israel, you don't have to ask yourself, how much rainwater was in that before it got to 40 sayas? Did someone fill it up? Did it get to 40 and then did it drop? And then did someone fill it up? Did someone do something with it that made it invalid? If it looks clean, there's no reason to assume that it wasn't. You didn't watch anyone invalidate it. The assumption is, I've come upon a random mikvah. The mikvah is a clean mikvah, and I can use it and assume that it is giving me the proper ritual cleanliness. Now, we're going to dial that in a little bit at the end of this Mishnah, but the rabbis wanted to start off with those assumptions. Okay, the land is clean, the mikvahs are clean as a general rule. I'm sorry, let me just point out that when they say the land is clean and the mikvaot are clean, they are talking universally within the land of Israel, meaning that even in a non-Jewish area, even in a non-Jewish city, that you would assume the mikvah are clean. And likewise, you would assume the land that you are walking on is clean. Remembering that the Mishnah was compiled during a time of Roman occupation, and that definitely there were areas that the rabbis were aware of that the majority population was not Jewish. Nonetheless, the general rule is, in Israel, land is clean, mikvaot are clean. Like I said, we're going to dial that a little bit more just a minute, but that's the general rule.
And that's because we are 1 week before Yom Ha'atzmaut.
You know, I hadn't been thinking about that connection, but you're right. The timing is very, very serendipitous. Remembering that we are all clean, that we are all part of the same nation, that our nation is all bound together in that way. It's a good thing to continue in our heart, especially with all of the disagreement, seems like too mild a word, that's been happening in Israel recently. Okay. On the other hand, the mikvaot of the nations outside the land. So now you are coming across a mikvah. It's a cistern that is built in the middle of Italy, in the middle of Spain and Tunisia, but it's not in Israel. These mikvaot are valid for those who had a seminal emission, even though they have been filled by a pump beam. Okay, so what are we talking about here? So you may remember, because we touched on this a while ago, that Ezra made a decree that somebody who had an emission, what's called a Bal Keri, could not read from the Torah or study until they had immersed. Now, eventually the rabbis themselves invalidated that edict, that they felt that it was too hard for people to observe and it was not required. There are still a few people who follow this pattern, but in general, the rabbi said, no one can keep this Ezra decree, therefore it is no longer valid, which is a whole nother conversation about which sort of rabbinic decrees can be overturned and under what circumstances, but that's not for tonight. So,
Rabbi.
But just a second, because this Bal Keri, this emission necessity, was a rabbinic enactment, or at least refined by Ezra, depending upon the arguments that others have. It meant that the status of the mikvah could be less pure. The mikvah did not have to meet the same requirement that the rabbis required for other usages of the mikvah. So even though here it was used filled by this pump beam, which was like literally pumping water by hand, which is obviously drawn water. Even though it was like that, nonetheless, for Balkari, even outside of Israel, you could use any mikvah for the Balkari that you needed to use. For other purposes, well, we're going to talk about that. But for this purpose, any mikvah, if it had water in it, it's good. Yes, sir.
Start curiosity. How do they get authority to overturn Ezra? I know he wasn't part of the rabbinic period, but didn't he stand over a court of 120, which is where the Knesset comes from?
Yeah, we're not going to go into that tonight, because the whole arguments about when you can and cannot overturn the laws of a previous court or rabbinic enactment are very complicated, very controversial, and sometimes the rabbis seem to be making decisions that are difficult for us to understand. So let's just say that the rabbis explicitly say that this was overturned because it was too hard for the people to follow. And we'll leave it at that for tonight. But yeah, that's a whole nother conversation. And we would need to go to a bunch of different texts to begin to piece it together. But mikvah is the name of the day, name of the game for today. All right, next part. Those in the land of Israel. Okay, remember, we started off with them. Well, now we're going to dial it in. When outside the entrance to the city are valid for menstruants, and those within the entrance to the city are valid for those who had a seminal emission, but invalid for all others who are unclean. Okay, so this means that the mikveh that is closest to the city, the mikveh that are actually inside the city, unless you are sure of its status, then you can use it for the Balkari, the same purpose that we talked about for the mikveh in other countries, but you cannot use it for nida or for other purposes. Because if it's inside the city, then we make the assumption that it is under constant use, that people are constantly washing in it, either themselves or their items, that it is not being used just as this protected mikveh space. And that means people are also pumping water into it or dumping water into it from a well. And we can no longer rely on the assumption that it has not been used to the point and refilled to the point that it's no longer a valid mikveh. Now, if we know that it's been under strict watch, we know that it's only been used for those purposes, we know that it's not been used for just filling and refilling willy-nilly, then yes, of course, you can still use a mikveh in the city. But as an assumption, if it's inside the city, then we have to assume that this is just a washing hole rather than an actual mikveh. On the other hand, if it's outside the entrance of the city, not right up next to the public area where people are constantly using it, then the assumption is the opposite, that it is fine for nida and for anything else, that mikveh is considered to be a regular mikveh, even though we don't have any proof that it has maintained that status. So the assumptions sometimes make life a little bit harder, like the mikveh in the city, and sometimes they make life a little bit easier, like the mikveh outside the city. But the rabbis are trying to say, look, there's no way for us to keep a constant watch. We can't have a shomer, a guardian at every single mikveh that is sitting there with a ruler measuring the quantity to ensure that it is always perfectly valid. We have to make assumptions, or else the concept of a mikveh is not going to work. Much like with kashrut, there have to be certain assumptions in how things have been done, or else we'll never be able to use these shared spaces. So if it's in an area where it's natural to assume that it has been through so many different cycles that it cannot still be considered a mikveh, then it's going to have this downgraded status. And if it's in an area where it's natural to assume that it's not constantly being used in a way that would invalidate it, then we will go ahead and give it that status as being a kosher mikveh, even though we don't have a full list and pedigree of every ounce of water that went into it. All right, and then Rabbi Eliezer wants to tweak it just a little bit more. Those which are near to a city or to a road are unclean because of laundering, but those at a distance are clean. Rabbi Eliezer wants to add in, yeah, but if it's right next to the road, then don't you think people are laundering in it and refilling it and all of that? And he wants to get even more careful. But that position is the minority position. Instead, we go with the general assumption. By default, the mikvot are Israel are clean. By default, if it's in a high traffic area right in the city, then it's not, unless we have proof otherwise. And if it's outside the city, then it is, unless we have proof otherwise. If we watch someone drain the mikvah and then fill it with a pump, then of course it's not a valid mikvah. Yes, Natan.
So Rabbi Eliezer position was rejected because they tried to simplify the original rule and didn't want to start with dealing with what is en road, near, or how far it is, or for any other reason. Because actually, it makes sense for me what Rabbi Eliezer say.
Well, it makes sense, but the general edict of Ein Ladavar Sof, there is no end to the matter, meaning that it's ad infinitum. If you say that 100 meters is okay, well, why not 99? Or why not say 101 is not okay? Exactly what distance does it have to be in order for me to make that assumption? So what he is introducing is essentially an unworkable position. If you say that it's near, but you don't give a firm definition, then it's hard to use. And if you give a firm definition, then how are you establishing that that definition is the right one? Do people only carry laundry a certain number of meters, and then they don't? There are so many other rules that could have been used. For example, if it had said, if it is near to a well, then it is unclean, because we assume that people have added water to it from the well. If it's far from a well, then it's clean. But again, can we really make that assumption? Is that assumption the most logical? Or are the rabbis trying to save us from going down the rabbit hole of what about, and all of the different permutations? Instead, they give us a very general rule, which is easy to follow. It's in the city, I got to have proof that it's okay. If it's out of the city, I have to have proof it's not. And that keeps it very straightforward and allows people to actually use the mikvah, which the rabbis were adamant was essential, that putting too many barriers between Israel and using of mikvah would cause people to not use the mikvah. And then you have people who are actually violating the commandments. So if you put too many barriers up, then all you're going to do is create a problem. Now, we can also go back to remind ourselves that the different details, many of the different details of Mikvaot are rabbinic enactments. And as such, if the rabbis wish to be a little more lenient about their own enactments, then that's not being a problem for the Torah. That's just adapting the rabbinic edicts to match the community. Yes, Aaron.
Hey, Rabbi, why would it be a problem to put exact numbers on it, though? Because I understand the argument that with 99 or 101, but the Mishnah does that all the time, especially with laws of purity.
It does put numbers like 40 sayas, for example, into place, and it will put numbers for minimum measures like 3 loaves, or if you eat a beitza, or if you eat, like a zait, like an olive size. I mean, yes, they're not averse to using them, but those numbers are derived from the Torah, and as such, they have they have a source that is reliable, that is dependable, and that is universal. If you are going to make a definition that is just my feelings about the issue, then you're going to have to bring much stronger data than just 100 meters. If you want to convince me that 100 meters is the magical number beyond which I can say people weren't doing laundry, then you're going to have to actually show me the real world data that shows that that's the issue. Because you're not bringing a pasuk, a verse, to make that claim. You're just bringing your lived experience, which, while that may be your experience, is not enough to actually dictate Jewish law for the rest of us.
Yeah, but Rabbi, in the first book, Kalim, on purity laws, they talk about, strings being so long. And the reason they say these strings are pure after this length is because it's unlikely that somebody would use a string or a handle longer than that.
Indeed. And like I said before, the rabbis will often elect to be more lenient in certain areas than others and elect to have definitions based upon usage rather than based upon those points. And sometimes the question you're asking can be valid, and the rabbis can simply say, that isn't the choice that we made for this particular point. They seem to be, like I said, erring on the side of ensuring that the maximum number of mikvaot that they can reasonably believe to be pure remain in use.
And Rabbi, just out of curiosity, is the 2,000-foot rule for the Eruvin, is that from the Torah or was that rabbinically made?
Well, it's complicated. It's a definition based upon their understanding of the Torah and their understanding of what the Torah prohibition on travel is within. So it is a lot of thin proof texts to support a very major part of Shabbat observance. All right, and you know what? I think we can just go ahead and get Mishnah 2 in here from chapter 8, because we're talking about Balkare, this idea of emission, and we might as well go ahead and finish that topic off, because otherwise we'll just have to start with it next time. So these are the men who had a seminal emission who require immersion. Now, again, like I said, this is no longer operative, but of course the rabbis are still going to keep it in line. If he noticed that his urine issued in drops or was murky, at the beginning he is clean, in the middle and at the end he is unclean. From the beginning to the end, he is clean. So this is a little bit of an introduction to some of the conversation we'll have when we get to Masechet Nida, but the color and the consistency of various bodily fluids can make a difference for how the rabbis would identify different types of emission. Urine is just urine, but once it reaches that drop, that like thickness or the murkiness, then they need to know what's going on. If it was only at the beginning of the process of evacuating the liquid, then that's not considered to be an emission. That's just whatever's happening there at the end, and meaning the tip. If it's in the middle and at the end, meaning that it was going just fine and then it changed color midstream, then that is unclean. And if it is that clean, unclear and odd consistency from the start to finish, well, then that just must be what your urine is like today. And so that is not considered to be a seminal emission either. So the rabbis are trying to make a determination based upon the timing of the emission in order to know whether or not this is actually a seminal emission or just another type of liquid that your body is producing. And yes, if you're uncomfortable talking about bodily liquids, then you may want to just go ahead and tune out for a while. If it was white and viscous, meaning whatever was emitted, he is unclean. Of course, this is the most common form of emission from a man that would be considered seminal. This is often referred to as like the white of an egg, an uncooked egg. Rabbi Yossi says what is white counts like what is murky, meaning that it is in that same category. And if it's just white without the viscosity, then if it's following the pattern that we saw at the beginning of the Mishnah, then if it's just at the beginning, it doesn't count, and he would still be clean. But the general rule is no. If it is white and viscous, it is considered to be an emission, and thus he is a balkari. Yes, Natan.
So why if it's at the beginning is taor?
So the idea is that whatever was at the beginning is not an emission. It's just, it's going to sound weird. It's just, gunk. It's just something there that's blocking the pipe. And so it's not an emission. It could just be dirt. I know we in the modern world, hopefully all have very reliable hygiene, but back then people were lucky to bathe once a week, and underwear had not been invented, and people spent a reasonable portion of their life not wearing clothes at all. If it was just you in the house, sometimes you'd sit down and be doing work and you wouldn't wear anything because you didn't want to get it dirty. because you only had that one clothing. So people were dirtier than they are now. So they wanted to make sure that it was a real emission before they rendered him impure.
But doesn't make sense in the next sentence. From the beginning to the end is tahor. But if you have something that is a liquid that is not looks opaque all the time, so for sure it's worse than having the middle or the end.
But their argument is, if it's from the beginning to the end, that's just what your urine looks like today. It's like maybe he was eating asparagus. And so it's not an unusual discharge. That's just the color and the texture of his urine.
Of course, it's like today when you eat beets, it's the same issue.
Exactly.
But
that's why they say if it's from beginning to end, then it's not an emission, then it's just urine. And urine is not a balkare. It's not, that's not the, we're not worried about him urinating, we're worried about the seminal emission. But yeah, they weren't going to take it to the lab. They weren't going to go to the doctor and have them run a test on it. They were trying to make assumptions. And this is the pattern that they would teach, yeah.
And the Levites were the one that checking, correct? The doctors in charge.
Well, but see, that's the thing. For the Balkari, you wouldn't have had the opportunity to go to the Levi when you began urinating. You would go to him and say, or to the rabbi, I began urinating and this is what it looked like, and then the rest of it was fine. Or I began and it looked fine, and then it turned a funny color. But you wouldn't be able to actually show him because, you know, it's gone. That's the whole point of, you know, getting rid of the waste. Unlike Nida, where a person can actually produce a cloth with it on, because the women would check to see where they were in the cycle. In this case, the information, the data would disappear. And so it was just down to what information was reported to the rabbi or the Levites.
So for me, what is difficult to understand, maybe in the 21st century, is why someone want to be so open about something that you will have negative consequences for yourself. And you need to self-declare that will go against you. Like if you are quiet, no one will know.
Okay, so first of all, the consequences are not huge, right? Nobody is taking you out and executing you because of this. Second of all, we have to recognize that it mattered to people. People wanted to be ritually pure, and they wanted to make sure that if they were ritually impure, that they knew, so they wouldn't do anything they weren't allowed, like go to the temple or eat truma or other things that you have to do while ritually pure. So there was a personal desire to make sure they were right. You know, I'll have people come to me and ask, you know, Rabbi, am I putting my tefillin on right? Now, why are they asking? Because they want to do it right. Are they making more work for themselves? Maybe, depending upon what they're doing, but they want to get it right. Now, in the modern world, you know, we can also look at this as like when people declare things on their taxes. You might be tempted not to actually say what you did. And, you know, what are the odds the IRS is actually going to come and check you?
They check you. That's the point.
They
IRS may check you, but the Levi or rabbi will not check you.
They might, but if you help your neighbor and he pays you $1,000 for helping him put the patio in his backyard, technically you're supposed to declare that on your taxes, but what are the odds they're going to find out? Well, some people, even if they don't think they're going to be checked, will still want to be right with the law. They still want to follow the rules. And so they will still declare those gifts or payments when they are declaring it on their taxes. So you're right. For the people who don't care about this, it doesn't matter. If someone doesn't care about purity, then they're not going to go and say, hey, this is what it looked like. And they're not going to care one way or the other. And that's another issue when we get to eventually, I'm sure sometime talking about tithing, of why the rabbis had to make assumptions about whether or not some people tithe or didn't tithe. And they knew sometimes that they had to be skeptical. because some people would not be doing things, like you put it, against their own material interest. But here, the rabbis knew that for people that cared, this is the information they would come with, and this is what they would have to deal with. Let's just go ahead and finish up. I'm just going to double check my memory here. Yeah, let's go ahead and finish up Mishnah 3, just because it doesn't need a lot of explanation. If he admitted thick drops from his members, he is unclean. The words of Rabbi Elazar Hisma. So the thick is, very characteristic, so that's not an issue. If one had sexual dreams in the night and arose and found his flesh heated, he is unclean. So meaning that if you were having a sexually stimulating dream and you wake up and you find that your body is responding, to be euphemistic, but you don't see any signs of emission, you still have to assume that during your dream, something came out. Maybe it has been wiped away by the blanket or by your pajamas, but at least some drops probably came out if that's the kind of dream you were having and that's your body's response. So here the assumption is that would be something that would require immersion. And then we're just going to talk about the fact that a woman too can discharge semen, meaning after she had had sex, that later on, some can still leave her body. If a woman discharged semen on the third day, meaning after intercourse, she is clean. The words of Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. Rabbi Ishmael says, sometimes there are 4 time periods, sometimes 5, and sometimes 6. Rabbi Akiva says there are always 5. Okay, we're not going to go into all the detail here, but this is based off the discussion in the book of Exodus with regards to being separate for 3 days before Mount Sinai, that was a specific precaution for the women, meaning that if the woman had had intimacy with her husband, that if anything leaked after 3 days, she would not be ritually impure and thus able to participate in the giving of Torah fully and equally. It wasn't about the men, it was about helping the women. Now, Rabbi Ishmael and the others want to refine that 3 days, because what counts as a day? Are we talking 24 hours from the moment that the initial intercourse took place? And the answer is no. They are dividing the day into 2 periods each day. There's the daytime and the nighttime, 12 rabbinic hours each. And the ultimate argument here from Rabbi Akiva is that there have to be 5 hours, meaning that there are 5 time periods, meaning the end of day 1, the beginning of the next period, the beginning of that period's night, the next period's morning and day, and then the next period's night. Once that time frame has finished, which is about 3 days, but it depends on where you had your intimacy, like when in the day, then you are good, and anything that might leave the body of the woman afterwards is not a source of ritual impurity, and it just is cleaned up, but it doesn't actually require immersion. All right, we will leave it there. Like I said, this is a fairly detailed issue. Look through Dr. Kolp's explanation, because he gives the timeline much more clearly than my explanation, but it's not super relevant for us right now. Thank you all. We're going to continue with discharges next week, so I hope you all are prepared for that, and I hope you will all have a wonderful week ahead of you. Please remember that Yom HaZikaron and Yom HaAtzmaut are coming up at the beginning of next week and should obviously be celebrated with all of our passion, or commemorated, of course, in the case of Yom HaZikaron.